When Arsenal signed Viktor Gyokeres in the summer, it signalled that Mikel Arteta wanted to introduce a change of play style into his team heading into the new season. Unlike the other strikers he's used in recent seasons, Gyokeres thrives most running at speed into space, suggesting that Arteta wants to introduce more direct attacking into Arsenal's play. But what does this more direct style look like? And why does it even matter? These are the questions we're going to answer in this video, but before we get to that, let's see if this new direct style is showing up in the data. Well, if we look at some of the more basic metrics, we can see that there is something going on when it comes to Arsenal, because what I've got on this viz in front of me is Arsenal's long passes attempted per 90 minutes. And as you can see, through Mikel Arteta's time at the club, you can see those long passes attempted are dropping down. This makes sense. He wants his team to be more controlled in general. He wants them to keep the ball, and playing long balls is a good way of losing it. But when we get to this season, with the caveat that this is only 5 games worth of data, you can see there's a big jump up back over this 60 long balls attempted per 90 line here. So certainly looks like Arsenal are going a little bit more direct. But actually, if we look at some of the other metrics available, we can see that things are a little bit more complicated. For example, if we look at Arsenal's direct attacks over time, we can see that although there's been a slight bump up this season, it's still well below the levels that Arsenal have hit in previous seasons under Mikel Arteta. So does this mean that Arsenal aren't going more direct then? Well, I think to answer this question, we really need to understand what a direct attack actually is. And Opta defines a direct attack as an open play sequence that starts just inside the team's own half and has at least 50% of movement towards the opposition's goal and ends in a shot or a touch in the opposition box. Now that sounds very complicated, but essentially what it means is that you need to have a sequence which starts in your half, ends in a touch in the box or a shot, and has at least half of its movement heading in a progressive direction. Which means that if a team is maybe passing the ball around the back for a long period of time before going forward, it could be that that doesn't count as a direct attack. So this metric isn't telling us that Arsenal aren't attacking directly, it's just telling us that when they receive the ball, they don't immediately go forward. They're maybe moving it around at the back a little bit more before they do. Another metric which complexifies things here is direct attack speed. Now, direct attack speed just tells us how quickly a team are moving the ball forward when they have a possession sequence. And as you can see across Arteta's tenure, this direct attack speed has slowly been coming down. Again, we've already talked about why that might be the case, with him wanting to have more control. But even when we arrive at this season, we can see that trajectory continues downwards. Now, this may seem as though Arsenal aren't attacking more directly, but if we break down the numbers per game, an interesting pattern actually emerges. Because what we can see is that Arsenal are able to modify their speed depending on the teams that they're facing. So for example, against Manchester United, 1.9 meters per second of direct attack speed, which is much higher than the average that Arsenal have had across the last few seasons. But then we come to the game against Leeds, where Arsenal's direct attack speed was much lower. And all of this indicates that Arsenal aren't trying to go direct all the time against every opponent. They actually are able to modify their attacking speed depending on the opponent. In other words, Arsenal are becoming more tactically diverse. And in order to understand why this is important, we need to have a talk about the history of football tactics. So at the back end of the 1980s, we come across this Italian coach called Arrigo Sacchi, and he's revolutionizing European football tactics. What he's doing is he's taking some ideas from South America and marrying them with some of the European ideas, and he develops a defensive system that is so successful, it leads to him eventually winning the European Cup with AC Milan. And this defensive system was based around the principles of zonal defending, where all of the defenders have zones that they cover. In fact, this version of zonal defending became so successful that within a few years, everyone was using it. So much so that by the time we reached the 2000s, almost every team at the top level of the European game is using these zonal ideas. Why does this matter? Well, because it had a knock-on effect on what teams were trying to do with the ball. Let's imagine that you want to progress the ball down the field against a zonal structure. The best way of doing that is to find pockets of space within that structure to manipulate the opponent around and then play the ball through the lines of pressure to move it down the field. This is why positional play became so popular at the time, because it provides teams with the tools they need to move the ball through these zonal structures. And the obvious way to stop this if you're a defending team is to reduce the size of the zones that you're covering. And almost inevitably what happens is that you're going to drop back, reduce these spaces down, and what that means is that you start opening out space here around the team in possession's build-up unit. You make it easier for them to possess the ball and harder for them to progress it. But this means that if the team in possession of the ball are smart in their build-up, what they can do is they can force this block deeper and deeper and deeper, and so what ends up happening is that the team who are defending are squeezed right back into their own penalty area. And this becomes a problem because the team in possession can now dominate the game. The structures are set up so it's much easier for them to keep the ball, they're very close to the opponent's goal so they can have lots of chances, and also if they lose the ball, the opposition are a long way away from their goals, so it's harder for them to score. And this is exactly why Pep Guardiola dominated football for so long over the last 15 years, because his teams could force opponents into this kind of situation and just chip away at them until they won. Now obviously the opponents who were being dominated didn't like this, so what we've seen over the last few years is a bit of a fight back from defensive teams. Rather than just dropping off and allowing the team on the ball to dictate play, what we've actually started seeing is defensive teams making the opposite movement, being more aggressive, going man-to-man and closing down players around the ball to make it much harder for the team in possession to actually progress the ball. And this is interesting because what's happened is the space that used to be available in build-up for teams is now no longer there. They used to be able to possess the ball in this kind of area, but now with teams stepping forward, that space has shifted. It's now much deeper in the field in this kind of area here. And that completely changes the task for modern build-up, because before it used to be about forcing teams slowly backwards. Now it's about playing more directly into these spaces that have opened out deeper in the field. And this now gives teams much more incentive to play directly, and there's a couple of options here. You can either play quickly through the lines of pressure to try and find this space in behind, and then you're essentially just running at a back line, or if the opponent are pressing you too aggressively, you can take the press out of the equation altogether and just go long. And so a team who are good at playing direct football then now have a set of tools that enables them to play against these more aggressive man-to-man presses. Which means that if a team like Arsenal can now play more directly, it now means they're going to be way more competitive against teams who are just going to try and press them high up the pitch. But it's not just that teams are being more aggressive off the ball, they're also being more aggressive on it as well, as they're pushing more and more players up the pitch in a bid to score goals. And what that means is that the same spaces are opening out that we saw opening out when teams are in build-up as well. These areas between the back line and the midfield line. Which means if they lose the ball higher up the pitch, the team who now have the ball can have a great deal of joy if they can quickly access this area directly and play against the opponent before their defence is set. So what we're seeing is that both in and out of possession, these spaces between the defensive line and the midfield are really vulnerable to teams who can play more directly. So that's why Arsenal might want to start playing more directly. But what does it look like in practice? And the best example of this, I think, is the game against Manchester United this season, because Manchester United played in a really aggressive way. What that did is it opened out space between their midfield line and their defensive line, and Arsenal could play quickly, directly into that space and had a lot of attacking joy. So what we have here is David Raya on the ball. Manchester United have just taken a corner and David Raya has caught it. But because Manchester United have positioned themselves very aggressively because it's a corner, this opens out the space between their defensive line and their midfield line. And that's the area that we're talking about here that Arsenal really want to target. And what we can see here is that Arsenal have positioned their players quite aggressively. They're well placed to be able to exploit these spaces when they open out between the lines. So that when David Raya plays the ball into this area, we can see there's 4 Arsenal players already attacking this back line of 3, and this becomes a 4v3 in a transitional moment. Now you might say to me, well, that's from a corner, and when a team has a corner, they're going to be more aggressively positioned. So here's an example now from open play. And again, a few things for you to notice. So Bryan Mbeumo has just crossed the ball in here, and Zubimendi is going to clear the ball out. Again, here's Manchester United's defensive line, and again, notice how aggressively the Arsenal players are positioned here. They're positioned in that space between the defence and then the rest of Manchester United's team, so that when the ball's turned over, the United players can't actually counter-pressure the ball because of their aggressive positioning, and so Arsenal, again, are well placed to be able to exploit it. And so the ball comes out, and Arsenal end up in a 3v3 against the back line. And you can understand now why this game might have resulted in very high direct attack speeds, because Arsenal are able to turn the ball over and then move it quickly down the field. And then one final example here, and I wanted to include this one because it involves a turnover of the ball in the midfield area. So what we can see here is Martin Odegaard turning the ball over, and as a result, Arsenal are able to make a counter-attacking move. Once again, the Arsenal forwards are really nicely positioned to be able to exploit the space between the midfield and the back line, and Arsenal end up in a 4v4 attacking the opposition goal. Now in the game itself, the problem for Arsenal was that the execution of these moments wasn't very clean, so they didn't generate very good chances from them, but you can see that the idea here is to generate this space in between the lines so that when they turn the ball over, they're able to exploit the gaps in Manchester United's defensive structure to generate these more dangerous attacking moments. Now the reason that Arsenal are able to play this way is because United are being very aggressive in their positioning, and that's just opening out space that Arsenal can then attack. But what about the games where teams don't do that? Because that's been an area where Arsenal have struggled in the past. For example, if we take a look at the games last season where Arsenal dropped points against teams outside the Big 8, there's a few things that we can notice. The first one is there's quite a lot of games here. These are games against teams where you would usually expect Arsenal not to drop points. But the other thing that stands out is actually the possession numbers that we see during these games. Now, there's a couple of outliers here, because in the Brighton game and the Bournemouth game there were red cards, but for many of the other games we can see that Arsenal are actually dominating possession. They're having a lot of the ball, but they're not able to find the win at the end of the game. Now, this makes a degree of sense, because what these teams are going to do is give Arsenal a lot of the ball. They're going to sit in their defensive blocks and say, come on and break us down, and if you can, fair enough. And we can see that Arsenal have struggled with that approach. And so the big question becomes, well, can we start introducing this more direct play style into these games to find ways of attacking at speed in space rather than trying to break down a low block? That could be a really good way of eliminating these kind of point losses in the future. And this is exactly what we've seen Arsenal trying to do this season, in particular in the game against Nottingham Forest, because what we can see from this screenshot is that Forest were very happy to just sit in a very compact space. You can see here that I've drawn the back line and the front line of the press here, and there's only 3 strips of the field between those 2 lines, so very compact. And what Forest is saying is, come at us, Arsenal, try and get through our defensive block. Now, in terms of playing direct, one of the things that Arsenal could do is just play directly in behind this high line, but that's not a great idea, because as you can see, Forest have some really tall defenders who are going to be good at defending those aerial balls. So maybe the better approach here is to try and generate space between the lines, as we've said, try and bait the opponent's press up, and then get the ball directly into those kind of areas. And actually what was really interesting to me watching this game is that we started seeing Arteta using ideas that we've seen from another manager, Roberto De Zerbi, who coached Brighton a few years ago. He uses these ideas in order to create space that can then be attacked between the lines. So here's one of them. What we've got here is Mosquera on the ball, and what he's doing is, you can see he's putting his studs on the ball. That's quite a provocative action, and what he's trying to do is getting the Forest players to start triggering a press, because if they trigger a press, as we said, when teams start going man-to-man and aggressive, it opens out this space in between the lines that can then be exploited. Here's another example, because what we see here later in the same sequence is Arsenal using bounce passes to try and trigger the press, because when Calafiori plays the ball into Zubimendi, what that does is it triggers the central midfielder jumping onto Zubimendi. Zubimendi will then play the ball back to Mosquera, and the hope is that that will trigger a whole Forest press high up again, opening that space out. And in the end, it works, because as you can see, when the ball goes back to Mosquera, it actually baits the Forest press forward, and now if we draw the lines on between the front line of Forest press and their back line, a huge amount of space is opened. Before it was 3 strips of the pitch, now we're up at 6, so they've doubled the amount of space that they've actually got available to them. And so what we're seeing Arsenal do here is using lots of techniques to just get that press baited up, open out the space in the middle, and this maybe explains why their direct attacking numbers aren't super high this season, because in these instances what's happening is there's lots of passing around the back happening before you then open the space that you can then trigger your direct attacking into. And that's exactly what happens here, because now that the space is open, Mosquera can play the ball directly into Martin Odegaard, who can play a bounce pass back into Zubimendi in space. Zubimendi carries it forward, plays it off Calafiori, and now we're in this situation where we've generated the same kind of conditions that Arsenal did in the Manchester United game, but rather than doing it by the opponents having the ball and having to win it back, they're able to do it through possession themselves. So we call this an artificial transition, because it's still a transitional moment, but Arsenal have generated those conditions through having the ball themselves. You can see you've got players able to run in behind, and you've got the back line running back towards their own goal. This is a really dangerous attacking situation. This is another example, and I've included this because I think in past seasons what Arsenal would have done here is try and retain the pressure that they've got on the opponent, squeeze them back into their box and go from there. But actually what they want to do is open out that space again, as we said. And so in the end, what they do is they play the ball back to Mosquera, the centre back. And as you can see, that just opens out those lines again, generates a bit more space for Arsenal to attack. And we start seeing them using even more techniques to try and pull that line even further forward and make more space to attack. So this is another thing that Roberto De Zerbi teams do. They stagger the centre back. So you can see that Mosquera is on a much higher line than Gabriel here. And the reason they're doing that is because if you play the ball back to the other centre back, often this will trigger a press. So the forward here will think, okay, the ball's going backwards, we're in a position where we can regain territory, and it will then start the rest of the team moving forward. Actually, in this instance, it doesn't work, and so the ball comes back to Mosquera. But again, we can see that Roberto De Zerbi technique of standing on the ball with your studs, being provocative, trying to get the team to think, this guy is goading us, we have to step up, we have to press, we can't allow them to possess the ball here. But Forest just refusing to accept the bait here. As you can see, they're keeping the line of the midfield and the defence super compact. There's not really much space for them to attack. And so Arsenal move the ball back again. As you can see, they've played the ball back off the goalkeeper. Mosquera has the ball now. But because Arsenal keep resetting the play, they keep going back to the goalkeeper, they keep starting again, they keep baiting the press, eventually we get this disconnect between the back line of Forest and the front line of their press. And this is exactly what Arsenal want. They want to have these spaces between the line. And so Noni Madueke can drop into that space, he can receive the ball, and again we end up with one of these artificial transition moments. Not only do we have Arsenal players able to push the back line back and threaten to make the run in behind, we also have Arsenal players running into the space that they've opened up through their patient build-up play, and in the end another dangerous attack is generated. So we've seen that Arsenal can attack directly when teams give them the space to do so, but they can also create the space in opponents' defensive structures to attack as well. But playing direct can also give Arsenal another weapon in their armoury, because teams who attack well directly can generate chances out of nowhere, and we've seen that happening a few times this season. Here's an example from the game against Leeds, and Leeds are sitting in a mid-block. They're trying to stop Arsenal from progressing the ball through the lines, but what they actually do by playing in this way is they create a lot of space in behind. So if we look at the Leeds United back line here, we can see there's a lot of space for Viktor Gyokeres to attack in the space. And all it takes is an easy ball from Noni Madueke into Ricardo Calafiori. Ricardo Calafiori can play the immediate ball in behind because he knows that there's a high line there, and already Gyokeres is getting ready to bend his run into that space. And we can see why these direct attacks are so dangerous, because these are the areas where Viktor Gyokeres thrives in. He can carry the ball in the channel, and the difference between what we saw in the previous screenshot and this is that that back line, which was previously so neat and tidy, has now been pulled all over the place, and these Leeds players now have to defend in transition, so all of their momentum is carrying them back towards their own goal. So that when Viktor Gyokeres hits the byline, all he needs to do is cut back inside. The rest of the Leeds defence is going to carry on their momentum towards the goal, and this generates enough space for Gyokeres to score. And of course, one of the most important goals that Arsenal have scored this season was against Manchester City, who spent most of the game sitting in a lower block, but at one point towards the end of the game, they stepped up high. They're leaving that space in behind for players to attack, and as we can see, we've got Eze on the ball here, we've got Gabriel Martinelli ready to make that run in behind. The Manchester City defence is not ready for that ball in behind, and in the end, Martinelli runs through, plays the ball over Donnarumma, and Arsenal end up getting a draw. So what these examples show us is that by being able to play more directly, Arsenal are actually much more tactically diverse. And this is important because tactical diversity will mean that Arsenal have more solutions to the problems that teams throw at them. And this is especially important when those problems mean that they're dropping points to weaker teams. All of which means that in the long run, they should be an even stronger competitor in the challenge for the Premier League title.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence, and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.